Every street and alleyway of New York City had turned into a graveyard of steel and glass. The once bustling metropolis of a city turning into a silent wasteland after the apocalypse. Marcus made his way through the shadows like a ghost, his footsteps making no sound as he ventured forward. His backpack was heaving with supplies, full of everything he would need for at least 2 whole weeks. He had found an abandoned convenience store, which was surprisingly stocked to the brim, and Marcus had collected canned food, bottled water, and some medical supplies. Despite the weight on his back, it was his heart which was in true despair. Each step he took on the deserted roads felt like a gamble. Every corner, potential death sentence. The undead were definitely a huge threat, but in the post-apocalyptic world he was now a part of, the living often proved to be much worse. Hearing footsteps from somewhere around him, he quickly ducked into an alley, not wanting to accidentally run into anyone or anything. His ears strained for the sound of footsteps, but when he heard nothing for the next few minutes, he guessed it was a false alarm. Experience of living in these conditions for the past 1 year had taught him to always be careful. He had been followed before, and that had definitely never ended well. He was determined to never let something like that happen again. Marcus was just about to get back on the road when he heard footsteps again, and this time he knew they were real. Someone was around him. But where? He pressed himself against the stoned wall, his hand gripping the handle of the knife he always carried with him. He had quite a few weapons of choice, but the knife by his belt was his most trusted and go-to weapon. The footsteps grew louder, coming much closer from his left. He held his breath, knowing fully well that it was definitely not the undead. Their sharp groans were far more terrifying than their footsteps, and the urgency of the running was enough to tell Marcus that these footsteps belonged to a human being. He stayed there as a few men ran past him, right beside the alleyway. They were dressed in makeshift armor with large rifles in their hands. Marcus knew exactly who they were: the hunters. When the undead had first appeared, throwing the world into chaos, everyone had been trying to make it on their own. Although a little after that, once most people were dead, a few individuals had formed groups of their own to survive together. Besides hunting the undead, they also preyed on solitary survivors like Marcus, stealing their supplies. In a world which favored survival of the fittest, one truly needed to be fit to be worthy of living. Marcus stood there, as silent as possible, while they ran past him, clearly looking for someone. He ran his gaze over the deserted street, trying to find something which might give him some semblance of a shelter and safety. Just then, he saw it. The alley right in front of him sported a narrow doorway at one side, which was partially hidden behind a pile of thick debris. The faded sign which hung above the place read, "Daily Gazette, Newspapers and Magazines." Marcus's eyes lit up with relief, and he did not hesitate for a single second before quickly slipping inside, sealing the door behind him with a rusty bolt. He breathed deeply, trying to calm his already racing heart. Usually, entering buildings such as these was never a safe bet, because they could be occupied by the undead or by a group of hunters as their safety shed. Although, the darkness and dampness of the newspaper office told Marcus that it was definitely empty. He had it all to himself. It was a little hard for him to believe his luck, but he quickly said a silent prayer in his heart, beginning to explore. He found the light switch just beside the door and turned them all on, trying to see if electricity was still running in the place. A few orange lights flickered open, throwing the place into a soft, warm hue. The newspaper shop was small and completely cramped. the shelves lined with dusty magazines and yellowed newspapers. Marcus had lived in New York City all his life, often walking this street, yet he had never noticed the small shop on the corner. That was how their world had been. Just like everyone else, Marcus had been so absorbed in his own life before the apocalypse that he had never even bothered to look away from his phone while passing by from here. And now here he was, finally beginning to take notice. The air was thick with the scent of ink and mildew, bringing Marcus a strange yet forgotten sense of comfort in this new world. He had forgotten what comfort and safety even felt like, and this sudden encounter with the sharp scent of printed ink was enough to remind him of the good old days. Despite feeling safe, he moved around the shop cautiously, not wanting to invite trouble for himself. He had managed to survive for 1 whole year. He only needed to hold on until things got better. That is, if they ever got better. What he loved about the place was how tiny it was, which made it easy for him to explore all around in just a few minutes. The smaller the place, the easier it was to assess and defend. Walking away from the front shop, he moved towards the back room, where his gaze landed on a spiral staircase, which seemingly led to a basement. Curious about what was downstairs, Marcus followed along the creaking stairs as they held onto his weight and crept to the basement. He searched the walls for a button and found one lone switch on the left wall. He turned it on, throwing the tiny basement into a cascade of similar orange lights. It was even smaller than the shop above, but was relatively cleaner and dry. The rains which had been plaguing the city for months now clearly had not reached here. The place was well packed, warm, and safe. Marcus continued to roam his gaze, walking further into the room. A desk sat in one corner, the surface cluttered with old typewriters and stacks of papers. He could see that whoever owned this shop clearly had a passion for writing, and too in a vintage manner. Exactly opposite from the desk with the old typewriters sat a small bed with a few blankets that were neatly folded on top of it and a pillow on one end. Marcus felt tears sting his eyes as he realized it had been months since he had laid down on a proper bed in a clean place. His heart leapt with joy as he looked on, sitting down on the bed carefully. It was strange how, in times of utter need, the simplest things felt like blessings. In his day-to-day life before the apocalypse, he had never even considered how his bed, clean sheets, and a warm blanket were blessings for him. But now that he was suffering, he realized their importance. The apocalypse had changed him, forcing him to appreciate the simple things he once took for granted. He knew this was it. This place was definitely going to be his sanctuary, and he needed to defend it with all his might. God had been kind to him by putting him in the path of this little shop, and he had to make sure to keep this place with him and him alone. All he needed to do was secure this place well enough to make sure no one could enter. Although for now, he could rest for a little while. Marcus laid down on the bed, covering himself with one of the blankets, and within seconds, he had fallen asleep. He deserved this much-needed rest. Marcus woke up with a start, unsure of what had just happened to him. He quickly looked around, remembering everything which had gone down in the past few hours. He had found this place and had fallen asleep here. But now that he was awake and well-rested, he needed to get to work. He needed to secure this place for himself, so he could truly call it his sanctuary. If someone else found it, Marcus would not be able to defend it in its current condition. He kept his backpack by the desk in the basement, climbed back upwards, his mind singularly on one task alone. He searched the entire area tirelessly, collecting everything that was useless in one corner and everything that might prove important to him in the other. He was ecstatic upon finding a toolbox, knowing how much the thing would help him both as weapons and as necessary tools to secure the newspaper shop. Over the next few days, Marcus stayed inside, surviving on nothing but the foods he had scavenged, while he worked with determination to secure his new shelter. Everything he found inside the office was used as material to secure the windows. Marcus reinforced doors by pushing all of the heavy furniture against it, making sure that no one from outside would be able to come inside through the front. He barricaded the only 2 windows in the place with sheets of plywood. It cut off any and all access to sunlight, but what Marcus needed was safety from the undead and the rain. He could live without sunlight for the time being. Finding a trap door in the back room, Marcus fixed its lock and crawled outside the shop, deciding to use this as the only entrance for his entry and exit into the place. He concealed the entrance from outside using broken steel wires and debris, trying to make sure that even if someone saw it, they would never even consider venturing inside. Once that was done, he built a makeshift alarm system using empty food cans and string, rigging them all together to clatter if someone tried to break in. His weapons were always at the ready anyway, and he would find ample time to react if someone tried to come inside while he was in the basement. Although, he knew that despite all of these arrangements, he was never going to be completely safe. He had found himself a sanctuary and had even managed to secure it. But the real challenge was staying hidden and making sure to keep this place hidden as well. Finding the right time, when the street was completely deserted, he ventured out through his secret trap door and removed the faded sign from the front, taking away all identity from the building of the newspaper shop. That was the best thing to do. This way, no one was going to see the place or notice it. He came back inside, staring at his 1 week of unstoppable determination. He could not believe he had somehow managed to do it, but fear still lurked in his heart. At night, the undead roamed, their groans echoing through the empty streets, reaching even the basement. On the other hand, the hunters were out there too. He knew they preyed on the weak, taking whatever they could find. If they found Marcus's shelter, they would definitely not waste a single second in killing him to steal the shop from him and use it as their own hideout. But Marcus could not stay here forever either. His supplies were mostly gone, and he needed to venture out to find more. This was going to be his moment of truth. He knew the city like the back of his hand and had already developed safe routes for himself. He knew he was going to be just fine if he stayed put and followed his game plan. All he needed to do was stay low and not run into anyone. Although now, he also needed to make sure that no one found his shelter. He got to the basement, trying to find food in his backpack, but everything was gone. It was time to go back out there. Marcus breathed in deeply, trying to calm himself. He armed himself with his gun, knife and dagger, and wore the backpack securely behind him. It was going to be a quick scavenging run, with him back before anyone would see or notice him. He crawled out through his trap door and hid it entirely, moving quickly and quietly into the evening. Marcus always simply stuck to the shadows, completely avoiding any open spaces where he might be an easy and open target for both the undead and the hunters. He followed along his usual routine, taking safe routes and hidden shortcuts, which he had memorized over the past year. Despite that, something felt off today. He wondered if it was about him now finally having a sanctuary for himself that he needed to protect, or maybe it was just his gut telling him that something might go wrong. Although he was out already, and returning back without supplies would be counterproductive. He would be quick, very quick. His gaze landed on a convenience store in one corner, which appeared relatively full, and he quickly headed inside, glad to see the filled shelves. Marcus took everything he needed, throwing it inside his backpack with the swiftness of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He was just about to head out when he heard it. Footsteps just outside the store. Closing the backpack and wearing it on his back once again, he ran behind the main counter, his hand already placed on his knife out of pure instinct. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to him, while Marcus stayed ducked, praying for his dear life. His heart was pounding, but he tried to keep his breathing in control, not wanting for them to hear him. He knew it was not the undead, the footsteps sounding very human. He looked up, raising his head a mere inch when he finally saw them. The same two men he had seen almost 1 week ago stood there, armed with heavy-duty rifles and wearing makeshift armors over their bodies. They moved through the store like predators, picking up items at their leisure. One of them continued to fill bags while the other scanned the aisles, clearly looking for potential danger or available prey. Marcus's mind raced, feeling an immediate and intense need to get out of there. But the gate through which he had entered was right behind them. He could definitely not use it. Marcus looked to his left, realizing that a small gate was just a few steps away from the counter, and if he was quick about it, he might be able to leave from here without them even noticing. He waited patiently, letting them move to the other side of the store before making his move. Once he was sure that both of them were looking away and were at enough distance to not be able to chase him, he jumped upwards, making a straight run towards the door on his left. He darted towards the door, but the sound of his feet alerted them, the two of them spotting him almost immediately. Their shouts echoed through the store as Marcus ran outside, not daring to look back. He knew they were right behind him, but still far enough that if Marcus was smart enough, he could easily lose them. He burst into an alley, his legs pumping wildly as he sprinted towards the nearest building. He knew they were not going to shoot at him with the lack of ammunition in the city, and at least in that regard, he was safe. Their footsteps were pounding against the pavement, but Marcus ignored that, ducking into a narrow passageway, his heart racing. The only motive he had in mind was to lose them. He could not risk everything he had built in the past week. If they caught up to him, they would probably kill him or take away his supplies and beat him up really bad to leave him as a meal for the undead. He was not going to succumb to such an awful fate. He scanned the buildings before his eyes, a plan devising in his mind as he ran. He already knew that the second building to his left had a fire escape just a few feet above his head. Without thinking, Marcus leapt. His fingers hung onto the bottom rung, grasping it with all his strength as he pulled himself up. His muscles screamed in protest, but he could still hear the footsteps of the two men. He knew he needed to do this. "He is climbing the fire escape," one of them shouted from behind him, alerting Marcus. Marcus still did not stop, climbing onto the rooftop of the building. The men reached the alley just below him, but Marcus disappeared over the edge of the second building, listening to them shout in frustration as they tried to climb the fire escape as well. He climbed over, building after building, knowing he was in full view of anyone who looked up, but he did not have much of a choice. Their shouts had faded in the background, making Marcus feel slightly safe. His movements were quick and precise until he finally reached the alleyway where the newspaper shop was located and used another fire escape to come back down. With the two men just behind him, Marcus ducked into the back, quickly entering the shop through his trap door and concealing it once again. He ran towards the front door, knowing the men were just outside, their heavy breathing reaching Marcus through the closed gates. He himself leaned against the gates, trying to listen to them, while he caught onto his own breath. Running with a heavy backpack full of supplies had been exhausting. He was here. He was right here, one of the two men shouted, and Marcus breathed a sigh of relief. He had done the right thing by sealing the front door. He waited until they had walked away from the newspaper shop, beginning to feel safe once again. He picked up his heaving backpack and disappeared into the basement, a silhouette fading into the warm lights. He knew the hunters and the undead were still outside, but at least for another week or two, he could stay inside and breathe, and perhaps try to read the newspapers which were scattered all around this place. He finally had a little bit of peace.